In a quiet small town, a silent veteran carries scars from a past filled with battles and difficult choices. But when old enemies emerge from the shadows, bringing deadly threats, he realizes there's no more running away. Time is ticking, tension is rising, and now he must decide, fight one last time or watch his community fall apart. What unfolds next could change everything.
The afternoon sun dipped low over the small diner in rural Georgia, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Inside, Sergeant Elijah Wilkins sat quietly at his usual corner table, savoring a slice of peach cobbler. The old army cap rested neatly beside his plate, its edges worn from years of faithful use. To the regulars, Elijah was a fixture, calm, dignified, a man who commanded respect without saying a word. But today, something was different. The sharp growl of motorcycle engines shattered the peaceful hum of conversations. The door swung open with a crash, and 4 men stormed in. Dressed in black leather and reeking of arrogance, they immediately seized the room's attention. The leader, a burly man with a twisted grin, scanned the room and locked eyes on Elijah. A smirk curled on his lips. "Well, look what we got here," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice as he swaggered over to Elijah's table. The other bikers followed, surrounding Elijah like a pack of wolves. The diners fell silent, eyes darting nervously as the tension thickened. Elijah didn't flinch. He continued eating, his expression unbothered, as if the bikers weren't even there. This only enraged the leader. He snatched the army cap off the table and tossed it to the floor. "You don't deserve to wear that," he spat, leaning in close, his breath foul and hot. The room held its breath. Elijah's eyes slowly rose to meet the man's gaze, steady and unafraid. He set his fork down with deliberate calm, then bent over and picked up the cap. Dusting it off, he placed it back on his head, his movements slow, almost ceremonial. His silence was louder than words, a quiet defiance that cut through the biker's bravado. "Think you're better than us, old man," the leader snarled, his voice trembling with barely restrained rage. His fist clenched, ready to strike. The other bikers closed in, eager for the fight. But before the punch could land, the sharp wail of sirens pierced the air, followed by the screech of tires outside. The diner's door burst open again, this time, revealing a SWAT team in full tactical gear, weapons drawn. The leader's smirk faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "Down on the ground!" "Now," barked an officer, his voice authoritative and unyielding. The bikers froze, caught off guard. "What the hell is this?" the leader shouted, but his bravado was crumbling. One by one, the bikers were forced to their knees, handcuffs snapping around their wrists. As the leader was dragged to his feet, he shot a venomous glare at Elijah. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You've just signed your death warrant, old man. We've got friends in high places. This isn't the last you'll see of us." Elijah remained still, his face unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes held a depth of experience that unnerved the leader. With the bikers subdued and taken away, the tension in the room finally eased, but something unspoken hung heavy in the air. This confrontation wasn't just a fluke, it was the start of something much larger and more dangerous. Elijah quietly returned to his cobbler, but the calm in the diner was fragile, ready to shatter at the next tremor. The past has a way of circling back, and Elijah knew all too well that old enemies never stay buried for long. The distant echo of sirens faded into the evening air, but the tension in the diner lingered like a dark cloud. Elijah sat quietly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup as memories began to flood back, snapshots from a life shaped by conflict, duty, and sacrifice. Elijah, a young man in his prime, stood rigid in his freshly pressed uniform. His commanding officer pinned a medal on his chest, recognizing his exceptional bravery during a mission gone wrong. He had saved his entire unit that day, guiding them through enemy fire with precision and calm under pressure. But the ceremony felt hollow to him. He had seen too much, lost too many brothers in arms. The applause from his fellow soldiers echoed in his mind, but his thoughts were elsewhere, already preparing for the next deployment. Elijah returned to Georgia after 3 decades of service. He walked into the same diner, hoping for a quiet life, but instead, he was met with subtle stares and murmurs. Being a black man in a town still nursing its old prejudices meant that respect didn't come easy, even with a chest full of medals. His wife, Martha, had welcomed him back with warmth, but the town's icy reception was a reminder that some battles aren't fought overseas. But it wasn't just the town. There were other shadows from his past that refused to stay buried. Elijah had been approached by a man, someone slick and well-connected, offering a lucrative deal. The man was setting up a network in the region, dealing in everything from illegal firearms to drug trafficking. He needed someone local with respect and influence to help things run smoothly. Elijah's refusal was swift and firm, and the man's demeanor had turned cold instantly. "You'll regret crossing us," he had said, a threat that still lingered in the back of Elijah's mind. The man who issued that threat? The very biker now sitting in a jail cell, plotting revenge. Elijah's grip on the coffee cup tightened slightly as the memories receded. The biker's threats weren't idle, this was personal. The leader had been waiting for years, nursing that grudge, and Elijah knew the man wasn't working alone. There were bigger forces at play, people with power and influence who wouldn't hesitate to crush anyone standing in their way. Elijah had spent his life in service, guided by principles he never compromised. He'd lost Martha a few years back to illness, and with her gone, all he had left were those values and the memories of the son he buried after losing him to combat. Those losses weighed on him, but they also steeled his resolve. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You all right, Mr. Wilkins?" It was the young waitress, Sarah, who had known Elijah for years. Her wide eyes were filled with concern. She had seen the whole encounter and was visibly shaken. Elijah offered a reassuring nod. "I'm fine, Sarah. Don't you worry about me." But worry she did. The whole diner did. People in small towns like this don't forget trouble when it shows up at their doorstep. And trouble had a way of spreading. As Sarah walked back to the counter, Elijah's thoughts shifted from his past to the problem now looming over him. The sheriff had advised him to lie low, even suggested witness protection, but Elijah wasn't one to run. He had fought too many battles to cower now. But this wasn't a war fought with guns and uniforms, it was murkier, fought in shadows with enemies who didn't play by the rules. He knew what had to be done. Old instincts from his days as a soldier kicked in. He needed allies. People he could trust, who understood that sometimes you have to take a stand when it's hardest. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper. Scribbled on it was a name and number, an old comrade, a man who owed Elijah his life and had gone on to run a private security firm. The call would be brief, the instructions simple. But what came next would be anything but. As he dialed the number, the flashbacks faded, and the path forward became clear. The battle wasn't over, in many ways, it was just beginning. The cold night air settled over the small town as the flashing red and blue lights faded from the scene. Inside the diner, a fragile calm returned, but beneath the surface, unease simmered. Elijah quietly finished his coffee, aware that eyes were still on him, some filled with concern, others with questions left unasked. He'd been in situations like this before, where danger lingered just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Elijah rose from his seat, the sheriff entered, his boots clacking against the tile floor. Sheriff Daniels was a grizzled man in his 50s with a face carved by years of stress and the weight of keeping the peace in a town that often resisted it. He approached Elijah, tipping his hat with a nod of respect. "Elijah," the sheriff began, his voice low and rough, "we've got those bikers locked up, but I know trouble when I see it. Those boys aren't the kind to just take a beating and move on." "I figured as much," Elijah replied, his tone measured and calm. "This isn't the first time we've crossed paths." Sheriff Daniels leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been tracking these guys for a while. They're connected to something bigger, a syndicate out of Atlanta that's been moving in quietly. They've got their fingers in everything from drugs to weapons, and they've got some local officials in their pocket. This thing's not gonna end with a few arrests." Elijah's eyes narrowed. He'd expected as much. What's your plan, Sheriff? That's why I'm here, Daniel said, rubbing the back of his neck as if the tension were a physical weight. I'm offering you protection, Elijah. Witness protection, relocation if need be. I know you're not one to back down, but this isn't a fight you can take on alone. Elijah remained silent for a moment, weighing his options. The offer was tempting in its own way, a chance to start over, maybe live out his days in peace. But he knew that running wasn't the answer. It never had been. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I'm not leaving. This is my home, and I'm not letting some thugs drive me out. The sheriff sighed, clearly expecting that response. I figured you'd say that. Just know that if you're staying, you're gonna need backup. These people don't play fair, and they'll come at you sideways. You've got friends who can help. Elijah nodded slightly. I've already made a call. Some old friends will be in town soon. We've handled worse before. Sheriff Daniels looked him over, a hint of admiration in his eyes. Well, if you're staying, then so am I. We'll keep an eye on things. But I need you to be careful, Elijah. They're not just after revenge, they're after power, and they don't care who they crush along the way. As the sheriff left, Elijah turned back to the counter where Sarah was nervously wiping down already spotless glasses. The tension in the diner had eased, but it was clear that fear lingered. Elijah knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. His stand against these men had put the whole town in the crosshairs. Elijah and his unit were pinned down, enemy fire raining from all directions. He made the call that saved them, a daring maneuver that involved leaving the safety of cover to create a distraction, drawing fire away from his men. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched, but they survived because they refused to run. Elijah had been the last one out, the weight of his choices heavy but clear. Sometimes you have to stand your ground, even when the odds are against you. Elijah walked out of the diner and into the cool night air, the memories of past battles fueling his resolve. He knew the bikers' words weren't idle threats, and he wasn't naive enough to think they'd forgotten. They'd be back, and they wouldn't come alone. As he made his way down the empty street, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a message from his old comrade, "We'll be there in 2 days. Ready for whatever comes." Elijah slipped the phone back into his coat and glanced up at the sky. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, the moon barely visible. The town was quiet now, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. A storm was coming, and Elijah would be ready for it. The next 2 days passed in a haze of anticipation. The quiet town went about its usual routines, but there was an undercurrent of tension that even the most oblivious could sense. The diner's regulars talked in hushed tones about the incident, and the local news made passing references to the arrests, but Elijah knew the real trouble was still brewing. The day before his old friends were set to arrive, Elijah spent the morning in his garden, letting the rhythm of tending to his plants calm his mind. It was a practice in patience, a reminder that even the simplest acts of care could yield something lasting. But his mind was never far from the danger looming ahead. Elijah's unit was deep in enemy territory, surrounded on all sides. Supplies were low, morale even lower. They were given an impossible mission: hold their position long enough for civilians to evacuate through a narrow escape route. The odds were against them, but Elijah's leadership, rooted in discipline and a deep understanding of strategy, turned the tide. They held the line, but it came at a cost. Friends lost. Innocence lost. And a deep understanding that sacrifice is often the only path to victory. That same resolve guided Elijah now. The enemy wasn't an organized military force this time, but a criminal syndicate with resources and connections that ran deeper than most knew. These men weren't just looking to intimidate, they were looking to dominate. That evening, Elijah sat down in his living room with maps of the town spread across his coffee table. He carefully marked the locations where trouble could erupt, areas with limited escape routes, places where innocents could be caught in the crossfire. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a video call. On the screen appeared a grizzled face, scarred but smiling, a man named Harris, a former Special Forces operative who owed his life to Elijah from an operation decades ago. "Good to see you, old man," Harris grinned, his voice crackling over the line. "Looks like you've stirred up a hornet's nest." "Couldn't let it be easy, could I?" Elijah replied, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "How many of you are coming?" "5 of us," Harris said, his tone turning serious. "We've got the gear, we've got the plan. This isn't our first rodeo, but it's been a while since we've been in the trenches like this. You sure you want to do this?" Elijah's expression hardened. "These men aren't just after me. They'll keep coming until they've got this town under their thumb. I won't let that happen." "Good," Harris said, nodding approvingly. "We've done the recon on their operations. There's a meetup planned at that abandoned warehouse on the outskirts in 3 days. Word is they're consolidating forces. We hit them there, we cut off the head of the snake." Elijah leaned back, considering the plan. It was risky. Taking the fight to the syndicate's stronghold meant they'd be outnumbered and in hostile territory. But it was the best chance they had to end this before it spilled into the town and put innocent lives at risk. "Understood," Elijah said finally. "I'll meet you at the rally point tomorrow." As the call ended, Elijah's gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the mantel. It was of his wife, Martha, holding their son, both smiling in a moment frozen in time. He felt the familiar ache of loss, but also the fire that had kept him going through countless battles. That night, he visited the small cemetery on the edge of town. The moon was hidden behind clouds as he walked the narrow path, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound. He knelt by Martha's grave, brushing away a few stray leaves from the headstone. "I've got one last fight in me," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm doing it for you, for him. I won't let them destroy what we built." He stayed there for a while, letting the memories wash over him, of love, of loss, of the quiet strength they had shared. Finally, as dawn began to break, Elijah rose and headed back to his home. The next morning would bring the arrival of his old comrades, and with them, the final pieces of their plan. The day was coming, and with it, a confrontation that would determine the future of this town. Elijah knew the risks, knew what was at stake. But he also knew that when the time came, he'd stand his ground, just as he had done his entire life. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as Elijah stood at the rally point, a secluded field just off the main road. Harris and the rest of his team arrived, their vehicles pulling up silently in the dark. No words were needed, the look in their eyes conveyed everything. They were ready. The abandoned warehouse loomed in the distance, its broken windows and rusted exterior giving it a menacing presence. This was where the bikers syndicate had gathered, thinking they would be the ones laying a trap. But tonight, the hunters would become the hunted. "All right," Harris said, gathering the group around. "We've confirmed they've got at least a dozen men inside, armed and ready. They're expecting a small skirmish, not a coordinated strike. We use that to our advantage. We go in quiet, disable their sentries, and move fast. We take out the leadership first, the rest will scatter. Elijah, you'll be with me. We're hitting their main guy directly." Elijah nodded, his focus razor-sharp. He was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't dimmed with age. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd spent decades preparing for. It was no longer just about him, it was about the people he cared for, the community he'd called home for so many years. As they approached the warehouse, the night's silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the building's aging structure. Harris signaled the team, and they moved into position. One by one, the sentries posted around the perimeter were taken out with swift precision. The way was clear, but inside, the real challenge awaited. The main room of the warehouse was dimly lit by hanging bulbs, casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. The bikers and their criminal allies were gathered around tables, counting cash and discussing their next moves. Their leader, the same man who had threatened Elijah in the diner, was at the center, barking orders with confidence. "Tonight's the night we take control of this town," he growled, slamming his fist on the table. "That old man thinks he's tough, but he has no idea what's coming. We'll burn this place down if we have to. No one crosses us and lives to tell the tale." The leader's voice echoed through the warehouse, but he didn't realize that death was creeping closer with each word he spoke. Harris signaled the team, and they breached the building from 3 different entry points. The operation was flawless, silencers whispered in the dark, and within seconds, half the men inside were down before they could even react. But then, chaos erupted. One of the bikers spotted Elijah and shouted a warning, triggering a hail of gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the steel beams, and the room erupted into a violent cacophony. Elijah and Harris moved with the precision of men who had seen this before, ducking, weaving, returning fire with calculated accuracy. The leader, realizing he was outmatched, made a break for a side exit, hoping to escape into the night. But Elijah was faster. Cutting through the chaos, he intercepted the man just as he reached the door. The 2 men stood face to face, the leader's arrogance giving way to a sneer of pure hatred. "You should have stayed out of this, old man," the leader spat, pulling a knife from his belt. "You think you're some kind of hero?" "I don't need to be a hero," Elijah replied, his voice cold and resolute. "I just need to stop men like you." The leader lunged, the knife glinting in the dim light, but Elijah sidestepped with the grace of someone half his age. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the leader, sending the knife clattering to the floor. The man's bravado crumbled as Elijah delivered a swift, calculated strike to his midsection, doubling him over in pain. It wasn't over yet. The leader, desperate and enraged, swung wildly, but Elijah blocked each strike with practiced ease. The final blow came when Elijah delivered a precise punch to the man's jaw, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The fight drained out of him, leaving only a beaten man staring up at his conqueror. "It's over," Elijah said, his voice firm but calm. "This is where your reign of terror ends." As the rest of the criminal gang fell to Harris's team, the warehouse grew eerily quiet. The few remaining bikers, realizing they were outmatched and outnumbered, dropped their weapons and surrendered. The leader lay groaning on the floor, his defiance extinguished. The police arrived within minutes, storming the warehouse and rounding up the surviving criminals. The sheriff himself cuffed the leader, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really thought you could take over this town," he muttered, hauling the man to his feet. "You underestimated the wrong people." Elijah stood back, catching his breath as he watched the scene unfold. He felt the weight of his years for a brief moment, knees aching, a dull throb in his shoulder, but there was a satisfaction in knowing that he had fought the good fight, one last time. Harris walked over and clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You did good, old man. We couldn't have pulled this off without you." Elijah nodded, a rare smile breaking through. "Just like old times, huh?" "Exactly like old times," Harris chuckled, before his expression turned serious. "But don't think this is over. They'll come sniffing around again eventually." "I'll be ready," Elijah replied. "We all will." As the night wore on and the scene cleared, the dawn of a new day crept over the horizon. The warehouse, now empty and silent, was a testament to the battle that had been fought and won. But Elijah knew that vigilance was the price of peace, and he was willing to pay it. The morning light spilled gently across the town as the dust settled from the previous night's confrontation. The diner, with its familiar hum of clattering dishes and murmured conversations, was back in full swing. But there was a different energy in the air, a quiet, shared understanding that something significant had changed. The people now looked at Sergeant Elijah Wilkins not just as the kindly old veteran who enjoyed his slice of peach cobbler, but as a symbol of resilience, courage, and quiet strength. Elijah walked into the diner, his movements steady despite the toll of the fight. He nodded at familiar faces as he took his usual seat in the corner. The patrons, normally lost in their own chatter, gave him subtle looks of respect, some even offering a small nod or smile in acknowledgement. Sarah, the young waitress, approached with a fresh pot of coffee, her eyes a mix of concern and admiration. "On the house today, Mr. Wilkins," she said with a soft smile, pouring his coffee. "You've earned it." Elijah smiled back, his expression warm but restrained. "Thank you, Sarah." The door jingled as it opened, and a group of children entered, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, chattering excitedly. One of them, a young boy with unruly hair, caught sight of Elijah and hesitated. He approached Elijah's table, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and nervousness. "Are you really a hero, mister?" the boy asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The diner grew a bit quieter as people turned to listen. Elijah looked at the boy, his gaze kind but firm. "I'm just a man who did what needed to be done," he replied gently. "The real heroes are the ones who stand up for others, even when it's hard. That's something anyone can do." The boy's eyes brightened at those words, and he offered a shy smile before running back to his friends. As the chatter resumed, Elijah took a sip of his coffee, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. It was rare, these days, to find a moment of stillness, but he savored it. Across the room, Sheriff Daniels entered the diner, his hat tipped low as he approached Elijah. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Elijah nodded, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. The sheriff settled in, sighing as he leaned back. "It's been a long couple of days," he said, rubbing his temples. "But thanks to you and your friends, we've got the worst of them locked up. The syndicate's power in this town is broken, at least for now." "For now," Elijah agreed, his voice calm. "But we both know they'll be back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but men like that don't just give up." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "True. But the town's different now. People are waking up, realizing they have a say in what happens here. It's not just the criminals who need to be kept in check, it's the ones who turn a blind eye." Elijah didn't respond right away. He let the sheriff's words hang in the air as he took another sip of his coffee. Finally, he said, "You're right. But it takes more than one fight to keep a town safe. It's about staying vigilant, looking out for one another. That's how you win in the long run." The sheriff smiled faintly. "I'll drink to that." He lifted his coffee cup in a small toast, and Elijah returned the gesture. As they finished their coffee in companionable silence, the atmosphere in the diner felt lighter, as if the burden of fear had been lifted. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting warm rays over the streets and buildings. Life went on, normal, peaceful, but with an undercurrent of strength that hadn't been there before. Before leaving, the sheriff turned to Elijah. "You've done more than your share, Sergeant. The town's lucky to have you. But don't be a stranger, we could still use your wisdom." Elijah smiled, a glint of humor in his eyes. "I'll be around, Sheriff. I'm not going anywhere." With that, the sheriff left, tipping his hat once more as he walked out into the sunlight. Elijah finished the last bite of his peach cobbler and stood to leave. As he did, the children from earlier waved at him, their faces filled with admiration. He waved back, a warm, reassuring smile on his lips. Elijah stepped out into the crisp morning air, the quiet buzz of the town wrapping around him. The fight was over, but the battle for peace never truly ended. He knew that. But he also knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up, to do what was right, the light would always outshine the darkness. As he walked down the street, his shadow stretching long before him, a black SUV with tinted windows cruised slowly by. The driver's face was obscured, but the message was clear. While this battle was won, the forces of corruption and intimidation weren't entirely vanquished. Elijah didn't flinch. He'd been here before. He'd stand ready again. But for now, peace had returned, and for a town built on small dreams and strong hearts, that was victory enough. The days following the confrontation were marked by a subtle shift in the town's atmosphere. The news of the takedown at the warehouse spread quickly, but the focus wasn't just on the arrests. It was on the quiet, steadfast man who had stood up against the darkness that had tried to take root. Elijah Wilkins had always been a familiar face around town, but now, people saw him differently. To them, he was more than the retired veteran who enjoyed his peach cobbler in silence. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that strength isn't always loud, and that courage can be found in the quiet conviction to do what's right. The local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Veteran Takes a Stand, Protecting Our Town from Crime." Below it was a photo of Elijah walking down the street, his posture steady, a quiet determination in his eyes. The article detailed not just the events of that night, but the legacy of a man who had spent his life serving others, first in the military, and now, in his own way, as a protector of his community. Around town, the atmosphere changed. The children who had witnessed the events at the diner talked about it with wide-eyed enthusiasm. The younger generation saw in Elijah a figure of inspiration, someone who stood for something beyond himself. They'd seen courage in real time, not as some abstract concept in stories, but in the flesh, a man who didn't back down even when faced with danger. Despite the newfound attention, Elijah remained humble. He continued his routines, walking through town with the same quiet dignity, greeting people with nods and kind smiles. But now, those gestures were met with more than just politeness, they were met with respect and admiration. The town held a small ceremony at the Veterans Center. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, just the way Elijah liked it. He was presented with a plaque of appreciation from the community, recognizing his actions. The words inscribed were simple but powerful, "To Sergeant Elijah Wilkins, for standing up when it mattered most." The applause was warm and genuine. As Elijah accepted the plaque, he looked out at the faces in the crowd, people he had known for years, some of whom had once been strangers who viewed him with suspicion. But now, there was a bond, a shared understanding that transcended past divisions. As he stepped away from the small stage, a young boy from the audience approached him, holding a notepad. "Mr. Wilkins," the boy began nervously, "I'm writing a report for school about local heroes. Can I interview you?" Elijah looked at the boy, seeing the determination and hope in his eyes. He nodded. "All right, young man. Ask what you need to know." The boy's questions were simple but thoughtful. He asked about Elijah's military service, what it was like to fight in wars, and what made him stand up to the bikers that day. Elijah answered with the same calm honesty that defined him, emphasizing the importance of courage, of helping others, and of knowing when to stand up for what's right. The boy scribbled notes, hanging on Elijah's every word. When he finished, he asked one last question, "Do you think there'll be more bad guys like those bikers? Are they really gone for good?" Elijah's expression softened. "There will always be bad people in the world, son. But as long as there are folks willing to stand up against them, they won't win. That's what matters." The boy nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes as he thanked Elijah and ran back to his parents. Watching him go, Elijah felt a quiet pride, not for what he had done, but for the lesson he had passed on. Rumors began to circulate that a black SUV with tinted windows was seen prowling near the outskirts of town. There was unease at first, whispers that the syndicate might be regrouping, plotting something new. But nothing happened. Whoever was watching knew that the town had changed. It wasn't just a place to be preyed upon anymore, it was a community ready to defend itself, bolstered by the quiet strength of people like Elijah. As the seasons began to change and the town slipped back into its routine, Elijah found a deeper sense of peace. The battles of his past, both on the battlefield and in life, had shaped him into the man he was. But it wasn't the fights or the medals that defined him, it was the connections he made, the people he protected, and the values he passed on. One afternoon, as Elijah returned to the diner for his usual slice of peach cobbler, Sarah greeted him with a warm smile. "Same as always, Mr. Wilkins?" she asked. He nodded. "You know it." As he took his seat, the children from before burst into the diner, laughing and chasing each other. They waved at Elijah as they passed, their innocence and joy a reminder of what he had fought for. He waved back, his heart swelling with contentment. Elijah finished his cobbler and stepped outside. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with hues of gold and purple. As he walked down the street, his shadow stretched long ahead of him. The town was quiet, peaceful, a place built on small dreams and strong hearts. The fight wasn't over. It never truly was. But for now, Elijah was content. The world would always have its challenges, but as long as people were willing to stand together, to protect what mattered, there was always hope. And for a man who had spent his life fighting battles, that hope was more than enough.